The red light is on, and the floor is yours, Jerry.
All right. Well, thank you. Well, it's good to see all of you again this evening. We are a long way into our study here. This is our 3rd out of 5, and we have a lot of the Old Testament to go. We spent last week, you remember, moving from the sort of poetic narrative of the first 11 chapters of Genesis. And by the end of chapter 11, the world is in the shape that we know it. That is, it's not perfect. There are multiple languages. There's lots of imperfection, bunches of ethnic groups. And so beginning in chapter 12, the world works much more the way that we know that the world works, and it looks a lot like we know that the world looks. And then in chapter 12, we move into the literary category of legend, stories about ancestors that tell us who we are, what we're like, or maybe even why we're like we are. And so that picks up with the story of Abraham. God chooses Abraham, makes a promise that Abraham will be a great nation and that his descendants will be a blessing to the world. But the problem is, of course, he doesn't have even a single heir, much less a great nation that he's produced. And so we keep having God revisit to make the promise. And keeping that promise gets more unlikely by the day because they're getting older and older, until finally, where we left off last time, after another covenant initiation ritual, then there's the promise that Sarah will have a child. But of course, she's 100 years old and doesn't believe that can happen. And so the text has her laugh, and the angel says, you just wait. We're going to be back here in a year and you will have a baby. And so we left the story basically there, waiting for that unfulfilled promise. We've seen Abraham already be unfaithful in sort of saying that his wife was his sister, and in trying to produce his own heir and having a child with Sarah's woman who was enslaved. And so when God has returned this next time to talk to Abraham, God gets ready to leave. And we're now in chapters 18 and 19 of Genesis. And we again want to take some time with a particular story to think carefully about it. So God gets ready to leave after this nice visit with Abraham and Sarah. And God turns around and says, you know, given who Abraham is, I should tell him what I'm about to do. And this is the story of Sodom and Gomorrah. So most of the time when we have these stories, we have to kind of figure out what's the main lesson that we're supposed to get. Well, this story was important enough that the narrative tells you what the point is. Unfortunately, we haven't listened to that very well in most of our treatments of this story. And so this story has become a very important one, sort of socially and even legally. And so we need to read it carefully and take seriously what the story itself tells you it's about. And so we can do that by turning to chapter 18, and we're going to start reading in verse 16. It says, and then the men set out from there, and they looked toward Sodom. And these are guys who had come and had lunch, basically, with Abraham. And Abraham went with them to set them on their way. The Lord said, shall I hide from Abraham what I'm about to do, seeing that Abraham shall become a great and mighty nation, and all nations of the earth shall be blessed in him? No, for I have chosen him, that he may charge his children and his household after him, to keep the way of the Lord by doing righteousness and justice, so that the Lord may bring about for Abraham what he has promised. Then the Lord said, how great is the outcry against Sodom and Gomorrah, and how very grave their sin. I must go down and see whether they have done altogether according to the outcry that has come to me. And if not, I will know. All right. So as we hear this introduction to the story of Sodom and Gomorrah, notice what the story says that it's about. This is supposed to teach Abraham and the nation that comes after him about justice and righteousness. That's the explicit topic of the story, that you should act in justice and live righteously. Now, we know the story of Sodom, that then the men, not including God, go down to the city. They sit around in the town square. Lot, the nephew of Abraham, comes and says to them, you need to come home with me. It is not safe to be out here. He takes them home. Word gets out, he's taken them in. And then the story says that the men of the city surrounded Lot's house and said, bring them out here so we can rape them. And Lot says, no, this is a terrible thing that you are about to do. And then he offers his daughters, they say no, and then the angels blind them and the city gets destroyed. Now, there are a number of things about this story that we need to look at carefully. The first one is another part of the introduction, and it is that when God says what's wrong, it is that an outcry has gone up from this city. That's the kind of language that you hear in the prophets, and it's always about social justice matters. That an outcry has gone up means that the poor and people who are disadvantaged are being taken advantage of. So that sort of language that the readers of Genesis should know from the prophets. So just like the explicit topic is justice and righteousness, so that language points you toward social justice kinds of issues. And then we need to think about the way governments were set up in the ancient world. People who were, well, first of all, there were no national governments in the era that this story is about. You had regional governments, you had kings of various areas, but there wasn't anything like international law so that you would be treated, decently wherever you went. When you traveled outside of places where you had social networks, you were basically helpless. If you were from another ethnic group or just any kind of a foreigner, you had no rights. There weren't laws that protected you in any way. And so you could be treated any way anybody wanted to treat you. So if you as a city treat foreigners poorly, that says something about your character. And the same thing was true about treating them well, of course. So sort of shortly, what is going on in the story of Sodom and Gomorrah is that these men go down to see, how does this city treat strangers? How do they treat guests? How do they treat people who don't have the legal protections that citizens have? And so that's why they go and sit out in the town square. And they soon find that these folks don't have much respect for human decency. They instead are going to take advantage of these strangers. They are going to abuse them. So that's why Lot takes them in, and that's why the conversation goes as it does. And that's why the men can't accept Lot's daughters, because the people of the city have already been saved by Lot's uncle. And they know what kind of power and what kind of army Abraham has. So if they do harm to his relatives, he has the power to do harm to them. So they're sort of a protected category. And if you notice, if you read the story through, even as there's conversation between Lot and these men, one of the things they say is, hey, you're a foreigner and you're telling us what to do. You know what we could do to you? But of course, they can't, because he's related to Abraham, who's right outside the door. And so they want to abuse the people who have no legal standing. So basically, this is a story about whether people offer hospitality to strangers, and not simple hospitality like a drink, but whether they extend to them the legal protections that other people have. Okay, and when the story is drawing to its close, again, we hear this language of an outcry. If you look at what the angels say after the confrontation between Lot and the other folks, and after they have been blinded, then in chapter 19, verse 12, it says, we'll start there. Then the men said to Lot, "Have you anyone else here, sons-in-law, sons or daughters, or anyone you have in the city? Bring them out of the place. For we are here to destroy this place, because the outcry against its people has become great before the Lord, and the Lord has sent us to destroy it." Notice again that language of the outcry that has gone up. Again, that sort of coded language for people taking advantage of those who are without power. And so they again say, this is what the story is about. And if you begin to read the laws of Israel later on, you'll see that there are lots of laws about how you treat strangers and foreigners. And it'll say, you were strangers in Egypt, so you ought to know how to treat people without rights, because you know how you got treated. And this story is one of those that says how you treat those without power is of central importance. It is not about homosexuality. In fact, the people who wrote this text had no concept of what we talk about as homosexuality. All the people who surrounded that house were married to women. Okay? And that's the setup that is just expected in this kind of a text. You don't have mentions of people with a different sexual orientation or something of that sort in ancient texts. So this is a matter of raping people when you can. As ancient people talked about same-sex sex, they never talked about a different kind of desire. Sometimes they talked about having too much desire. That is, if a man couldn't be satisfied by having sex with women, then he would also, not alternatively, but also have sex with men. So it wasn't a matter of which sex you were attracted to. Again, everybody who's guilty of surrounding Lot's house is somebody who is in a heterosexual marriage. And so we have used this text to argue for sort of an ethical issue that it simply does not address, that it really has absolutely nothing to do with. Now, you may be thinking, but wait a minute, the way they were going to abuse people is that they were going to have homoerotic relations with these people that they could. But that who they were going to have sex with is not the problem of this text, is clear from a parallel story in the book of Judges. It's the story that the book of Judges ends with, in fact, and it's a really terrible story. It's a story about a person who's a Levite who has multiple wives, and one of them, a second-class wife called a concubine, gets dissatisfied with things and goes home to her parents' house. After a while, he's sorry for the way that he's done things, and so he goes and seeks her out. And after a week or so at her parents' house, he returns home. But on the way home, they have to spend the night in the city in between sort of his home and the parents' house of the woman. And so they go to the city square, and are going to spend the night there, just like they do in the Sodom story. An old guy comes in and says, "Oh no, you can't stay here. This is not safe." And he takes them in, just like Lot does. The men of the city surround the house when they hear that the strangers are there, and they say, "Bring that man out here so that we can rape him." And the man says, "No." Well, this guy who went and got this wife back is not a great person. And so he throws her out to the crowd, and they rape her all night and seem to kill her. And so she manages to crawl back to the door the next morning. He puts the body on his donkey, takes it home, cuts it up into 12 pieces, and mails it out to all the tribes of Israel and say, "Look at what these people did." And they all got together and wiped out the town because of the grievous sin that it was. Now notice, it's really the same story, except this time the rapists are successful. This time they actually get their victim. But the point of the story is not which sex gets raped. It is that these people, the inhabitants of this place, take advantage of people who don't have the kind of connections that make them sort of full human beings, that make them people that have to be accorded the legal status of a human being so that you can't abuse them in those ways. So we really missed much of what this story is about by the uses that we've made of it. And we've missed the central point, which is that how a nation or a city treats those who are powerless is a major concern of God. Well, let me stop there for a minute and see if there are thoughts about this text.
Hey, Jerry,
Uh-huh.
I was waiting for somebody else to ask something, but I said, well, I'll just go ahead. Okay, did not Paul in his writings talk about the sin of homosexuality?
I think we should make an important distinction here and distinguish between homosexuality and homoerotic activity. That is, having sex with somebody of the same sex is a different thing than having an orientation toward them rather than toward the opposite sex. When Paul, and there's only one real discussion of it in the New Testament period, when he talks about homoerotic activity, he assumes that the people who are engaging in it are all in a heterosexual marriage. And so this is by definition unfaithfulness. And when he talks about it, he attributes it, and this was a common sort of trope in Judaism of the first century, that people have those kinds of relationships or those kinds of relations because they started worshiping idols. So, and worshiping idols clearly leads to all sorts of things that he found unacceptable. And so as Paul thinks about it, he doesn't have an orientation toward the same sex in mind. He, again, has in mind acts of unfaithfulness to your marriage that are committed with people of the same sex. Yeah.
Jerry, this is Candy Field, and is that not a lot of interpretation? I mean, and the whole thing seems to focus on sex, although you say that's not, expressly what it's about.
Right. Well, it tells you what it's about. Remember, it's about justice and righteousness. That's what the text tells you, in the introduction to the story. And while sex is certainly sort of the weapon of taking advantage of these people, it's not who they have sex with that matters. That is which sex. Because remember the story in Judges, there the men rape a woman and it's just as bad. So it's about taking advantage of those people, not about which sex they choose.
So does it have something to do with, so essentially what you're getting at is it has something more to do with like the laws of ancient hospitality that would have existed in those cultures rather than the physical acts that are described?
Yes, laws of hospitality in the sense of laws that tell you that you must treat all people as human beings. So they just say, if you don't have the kinds of protections that others do, then we can do to you anything that we want. Jan?
Jerry, doesn't this also have parallels with historically rape, same-sex rape going back as part of warfare and domination? I mean, culturally, my understanding of history is that this rape was, and let's be honest, to this day is woven into those who have power. And often same-sex, often, I mean, it makes us highly uncomfortable, but it is woven into human history. And we just don't like to talk about it.
Yeah. Well, yes. Yeah, rape has certainly been a part of expressing dominance and power for as long as we have records of such things. Yes, that's right. And it didn't matter which sex. Other thoughts or questions? I know this is a very different reading of this text than we're used to, but I think it's the reading that actually fits what is there. Again, once it announces what the theme is going to be, once we see the parallel in the book of Judges, then it's clear that the emphasis that we have given it isn't the one that these writers or their original readers would have understood. Yeah, David?
Jerry, just to add to your pointing out the sin of Sodom being injustice, I think it's important also to see that in Ezekiel, and this is from chapter 16, verse 49 and following, Ezekiel, there's a passage that says, "This was the guilt of your sister Sodom. She and her daughters had pride, excess of food, and prosperous ease, but did not aid the poor and needy. They were haughty and did abominable things." So, I mean, the sin was against the poor and needy and whatnot, just as you're saying. That's what was carried down in the tradition.
Yes, that's right. Thank you. Well, let's say it this way. None of the references to Sodom in the rest of the Bible mention same-sex activity.
Right.
That was not seen as the problem when other biblical writers read this text.
That's what
Right.
I wanted to say. Yeah. Thanks, Jerry. Yeah.
I have
Right.
another question.
Okay.
When can you trace when this became a distorted understanding?
Yeah. I don't know the history of interpretation. I do know that, and we'll see why later on, that Jews avoided same-sex relations. Again, not relationships. Those weren't really a part of what anyone knew or thought about, because they were Gentile things to do.
Mm-hmm.
So by the first century, when Paul's writing, it's just same-sex activity was seen as a thing Gentiles do. We don't do that, and we'll see why in the next week or so. Well, it can't be much more than a week. We only have 2 to go. So, but we'll get to why. So, all right. Well, we can let that soak in a little bit and think about it as we go ahead and think about the narratives that finish out the story in Genesis. We really don't have time to go through them like we have, but we should remember in reading them that they all have a theological point. They're not interested in precise history. They are interested in getting you to see something about who God is and who you are supposed to be as the people of God and how you are supposed to live. Remember, a couple weeks ago, we mentioned those other books that the biblical writers will say, and if you want to read more about this, go read the book of Jashar or the book of the Acts of Solomon. So if you want political history, go read those. If you want to see an interpretation of these events that focuses on God and what God is doing, then you should read these biblical texts. All of the stories of the ancestors of Israel and all of the stories about the Israelites in the wilderness are all these same kinds of stories that try to define who they are as a people, what their relationship with God is, what their relationship is with the land of Canaan and with the people of the land of Canaan. And one thing we see about these stories is that this is not a rosy picture. They don't paint their ancestors as the most wonderful of people. You notice we already saw Abraham, not that great a guy, right? He, lets his wife be taken to somebody else's house. They show the people, including the ancestors, to be unfaithful almost all the time. And so If you think about Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, they are all exceedingly flawed characters. And think about Jacob's son. They sold their brother into slavery because they were mad at him. I mean, these aren't nice people. And so as they are presented, they are sort of examples of the kind of people that we are. And they wrote them that way. I mean, if I were going to write about my ancestors, you know, they might look better. But they didn't. And they didn't because of where they put these stories together. Remember, these books come together while the people are in exile. They give this interpretation to the stories that have been passed down because of where they are. I mean, here they are. People who say, our God promised us a nation, a land, a temple. We've got none of that stuff. It's all been taken. We're all here in exile. So how do you explain that? Is it because God was too weak to defeat these other nations and gods? Is it because God's not trustworthy? Why are we here? And their answer to the why was because we have been unfaithful. We haven't lived up to our covenant with God. In fact, the covenant with God says, if we don't do what we're supposed to, we turn and worship other gods, we treat people improperly, then bad things are going to happen to us. And you know what? They have. So we notice that God is still with those people, though. And so that gives them the hope that God is still with them, too. And it's going to be sort of that perspective that informs the way they tell the stories of their own people. So they don't make them look good, because by showing their unfaithfulness, they keep their faith in God and keep their hope that God will bring them back to the land, because God won't desert them. There was a question a minute ago about whether Jewish interpreters read these stories as legends. And yes, they do. And from ancient times, they read them as non-historical. I think I mentioned last week that Philo of Alexandria, a Jewish interpreter of biblical stories and other things from the first century, read the story of Abraham and wrote a book called The Life of Abraham. And he thinks Abraham's a bad enough character that he just says, now these things didn't really happen. But the stories are told this way because they are the story of the ascent of a soul to God. So we're not really that bad. You know, our ancestor didn't really do that, but we tell this story so that we get this other more important point. Now, so as early as the time of the New Testament, you have Jewish writers reading these stories as non-historical, but as stories that teach us other sort of theological kinds of lessons. Well, all right. Let me stop there again and see if there are any other thoughts or questions. Okay, we are temporarily, at least, going to leave narrative literature. There's a lot of narratives that we're skipping. We haven't talked about, you know, the rest of the ancestors of Israel. We haven't talked about the Exodus and those kinds of things. But in some ways, we're more accustomed to giving theological readings of things like the Exodus and the way that God rescues and redeems. And so we're going to have to skip ahead. We're going to come back to different narratives, but we're going to skip on to another part of the Pentateuch now, and that is the laws that are given. There, I know, often seen as the most boring thing you can think of. Who wants to read all of these laws that set out how you're supposed to organize society and how you're supposed to do religious things? Well, the Israelites saw the law as a great blessing. It was something that helped them think about how to live as the people of God and even to have the best life you could have. And when we think of the law, we think of it as this huge burden. That, geez, they had all those rules they had to keep. It must have been terrible. It means it's, all that they're just trying to earn their place with God. But that's not the perspective of any of these texts. And it's not the perspective that even the law gets introduced with. And if you think about the beginning of the giving of the 10 commandments, here the people have come out of Egypt. They've, put God to the test a time or two, and they finally get to Mount Sinai. God comes to the mountain and starts to speak to Moses. And here's the way the telling of the 10 commandments starts. Then God spoke all these words. I am the Lord your God, who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of slavery. You shall have no other gods before me. Notice the prelude to the law is the telling of the gracious act of God that came before it. The basis for saying, Israel, live by this law, is that God has already claimed them as God's people. God has already saved them. God has already rescued them from Egypt. And so it's on the basis of what God has already done for them that God says, let's be in covenant together. I have acted graciously to establish this relationship. Let me tell you what it takes to stay in it. So keeping the law for Israel was never about establishing a relationship with God. It was always about maintaining a relationship. It's always about staying in the covenant. And that has absolutely nothing to do with being a legalist. I mean, every relationship in the world has rules that you have to live by. And if you don't believe that, ask your spouse. Hey, are there rules to this relationship? Yes, there are. Hey, or ask somebody you're in business with. Are there rules to this relationship? Yes. If you're going to be in a relationship with somebody, there have to be rules. And so God says, here they are. Look what I've done for you. So if you want to stay in relationship with me, here's how you do it. And I'll keep doing stuff like that. So what you get is something very much the way that we often describe why Christians behave the way they do. God has acted graciously on our behalf, has given us salvation and a relationship, and in response to that, we live the way God says that we should. So as the law gets introduced, it's that same kind of sort of God acting first, and then human beings needing to respond to that relationship with God. And as the 10 Commandments set it out, those expectations about being in relationship with God have to do with directly how you relate to God, and they have to do with how you relate to one another. That is, how your relationship with God is related to whether you treat other human beings the way God says other human beings are supposed to be treated, whether you treat the land the way God says you're supposed to do it, how you treat your animals. I mean, all of those sorts of things get put into this category. Here's the way you live when you're in this relationship. Okay? And so the law takes on that importance of being the blessing that tells you how to stay in relationship with God. Well, the book that we think of as the worst possible thing to have to sit down and read, unless you have insomnia, is the book of Leviticus. So let's talk about Leviticus for a little bit. It's not nearly that bad. Okay? In fact, it's a pretty amazing book. Half of it is about instructions about who priests are supposed to be and how they're supposed to carry out their duties. Now, I want you to think about that for a minute, remembering when this book got written. It gets written during the exile. There is no temple to worship at. This whole book is one enormous act of faith. These priests with no temple, they've just been booted out of Jerusalem. They have just seen their temple razed. And they go and write a book about how we're going to lead worship in that temple. They have that kind of faith in God. They are that certain that God won't desert them, that certain that God is going to be gracious again, bring them back to the land, give them that temple, and they want to be ready this time to do it right. They want to be ready to be able to serve God in the temple in the ways God wants to be served.
He's talking about the Babylonians.
So they have all of this written out. So however long it takes, we'll be ready when that temple gets rebuilt. So, and if you think about what you would be thinking about if all the Christian churches in the world just got burnt down, and you said, you know, let's sit down and write down all of the hymns that we can remember, because one day we're going to sing them in churches. And that's what these people have done. Okay? So they show enormous faith in God just by writing this boring book. You know, it's an amazing act of faith. And one of the concerns that they express in much of the book, especially the part about priests, is concerns about what is clean and unclean. Now, lots of times we mistake what being clean and unclean is about. It's really about a pretty narrow thing. To be ritually pure or to be clean means you are prepared to enter the presence of God. You are ready to go to the temple. Now, I want you to think about ancient Israel for a minute. You are a person who lives, let's say, in Galilee, that is miles and miles away from Jerusalem. How often do you have to worry about going into the temple? Maybe once a year, maybe once every 5 years. Yeah, you just don't get down there very much. So if somebody says, you are unclean, you go, You know, it didn't really matter. But if you were a priest, it did matter. They had to be ready to enter the presence of God. And so they give a lot of attention to ritual purity. And being unclean was not the same thing as committing a sin. There are many good and right things that people did that made them unclean. For example, it's part of honoring your father and mother to give them a decent burial. But if you are in the same room as a corpse, you are unclean. So you keep the commandment and it makes you unclean. It doesn't make you a sinner. It just means you're not ready to enter the presence of God until you've gone through a ritual that then prepares you to enter the presence of God. So as the laws accounting in Leviticus get started, it is really focused on the concerns of priests. So the first 16 chapters all address priests. It assumes that they are all of the tribe of Levi, that they are married, and that they don't all serve in the temple at the same time. So there were way too many Levites to all be in the temple at the same time. So they had other jobs. So they might be the religious expert out in a village that they live in or something like that. And they would have their shift kind of to come to the temple. Then at chapter 17, Leviticus changes so that it now addresses the nation of Israel more fully. And chapters 17 through 26 are sort of a separate part of the book known as the Holiness Code. I just looked down to see what time it was and noticed we've been doing this for a while. Do you want to take a break before we talk more about Leviticus? I know you're all excited to talk about Leviticus, but
let's take a 5-minute break here. You can get up, move around, use the restroom, get a glass of water if you need to, and we will reconvene in 5 minutes at, according to my clock, 7:56. And we are back.
all right. Well, as we jump into this second part of Leviticus, again, chapters 17 through 26 are known as the Holiness Code. And they're known as that because of the way that they spend so much time talking about holiness, including God's holiness. Constant features of this section include the phrases, "You be holy because I am holy," or there'll be a commandment and then the text will just say, "I am the Lord your God." So that's the way you are supposed to act. So as they write these rules about how to live, they intend them to reflect who God is. Remember, be holy because God is holy. So the people of God are supposed to, in the ways that they live, reflect who God is. They mirror who God is by their behavior. And so what this whole bunch of laws in Leviticus want to do is tell them what it means to look like the character of God in their context. Here's how you live out who God is. Now, I hope again that that sounds like a good plan. I think that the basis for all Christian ethics is the character of God. God's people work for justice because God is just. God's people love because God is love. So what we are as the people of God grows out of who God is. That started back in Leviticus. They say the same thing. You need to be holy because God is holy. Now remember, the word holy has two distinct meanings. One of those meanings is morally upright. That is, you do the right things. The second meaning is that you are different. You are distinct. God is holy in the sense that there's no other being like God. God is holy in the sense that God is morally perfect. So both of those characteristics are meant when God says, you be holy because I am holy. So God wants God's people to be morally upright, and these laws are going to emphasize that God's people need to be very different from the people who are around them. Now, within this larger holiness code, there's a smaller sort of discrete section with its own introduction and conclusion. It's chapters 18 through 20. And those chapters set out social morality and make marriage the cornerstone of society. As the Israelites are setting out these laws, they're not just religious laws. They're laws about how we're supposed to live in all contexts. And so how you do business deals was part of how you live out being holy, how you live out reflecting the character of God. And so that they want to talk about sort of family life is not a surprise. That's another place where you reflect who God is in the way that you live. And one of the things, and this may sound strange to us, but one of the things that these laws want to do is make Israelites odd. They want to make them different from all of their neighbors. Because remember, all of their neighbors worship other gods. Everybody in the world worships multiple gods. And if some Israelite comes up and says, listen, I know you guys, have the God of sheep and all that, but, I just worship one God. Everybody around them goes, you are probably the stupidest person I know. I mean, how could you do that? I mean, what if you were a grain farmer? Wouldn't you have to have a different God? A different God takes care of that stuff. And so everywhere they look, everybody that they would associate would say, you're an idiot. Why would you do that? You're going to be taken advantage of. Other people are going to be able to get the best of you because they are going to be talking to the right gods. And you are stuck over there with just one. So it seemed like the most foolish project you could take on. Now, and the people in exile said, when it came to that whole project of worshiping only one God, we were terrible. Okay, we didn't do it. Remember when we read about King Josiah the first week, when it's just like 20 years from the time that the nation falls? They didn't keep the Passover. They didn't do any of the things that they were supposed to do to be pleasing to God, including just worship one God. And in fact, there are images of other gods in the temple in Jerusalem. They worship multiple gods in God's temple. So a few prophets and folks have said, listen, we should only worship God. Everybody else said, that's stupid. And so as they go to say, okay, part of the problem was we were unfaithful to God in the sense that we worship multiple gods. How are we ever going to convince people to worship just one God? And somebody said, if we were too weird that other people wouldn't associate with us, that would help. they wouldn't be around to tempt us with their gods. And so we're going to have a bunch of rules that mean we can't associate with most people. And so they had rules like you can't wear cotton and wool blends. You know why? Other people do. So you can't go shopping where everybody else shops because it violates being holy in the sense that we are distinct. Well, there are certain foods that we can't eat. Everybody else eats them. And so we can't go to their parties. There are all kinds of ways that the rules that get set out distinguish Israel from all other people. It's the only way they thought they would ever worship just God. So we're going to be among ourselves as the people who are committed to worshiping just God. This little section of Leviticus that talks about social morality and sexual morality, it is part of that. We can't be like other people. And so even the introduction of this code about how to live, how to set up a good moral society starts out with saying, don't be like those other people. You have to be holy in the sense of being different. So the beginning of Leviticus chapter 18 reads like this. The Lord spoke to Moses saying, speak to the people of Israel and say to them, I am the Lord your God. You shall not do as they do in the land of Egypt where you lived, and you shall not do as they do in the land of Canaan to which I am bringing you. You shall not follow their statutes. My ordinances you shall observe, and my statutes you shall keep following them. I am the Lord. You shall keep my statutes and my ordinances. By doing so, one shall live. I am the Lord. So, how is it that you live for God? Well, you do it by not doing what Egyptians do, not doing what Canaanites do, not doing what any of those people out there do. You live by these rules. That's the way God will be with you, because God's not happy with those people out there. Goes on other places to say, listen, those people live the way they do. God threw them out of the land. That's why they're gone, and you get it. So these chapters are going to set out a very distinctive society. And so the very first section starts out by talking about who you're allowed to marry. And the first thing it says is you can't marry really close relatives. And it starts that way because it just said, don't be like the Egyptians. And do you know what the Egyptian royalty does? They marry their brothers and sisters. So you can't be like the Egyptians. You have to be different from them in this degree. And it tells you which cousin you can marry, how far out it has to be, and whether you can marry your brother or sister's previous mate. I mean, all kinds of things. Like, you can't be like those people. They do those kind of things, so you cannot. And then the text turns to what Canaanites do. So here are what Canaanites do. And so guess what? You can't do that either. Okay, you have to be different from the way the Canaanites are. And finally, it gives some consequences for neglecting those rules. And so as we think about the way that this text says you need to organize families, how you need to set up society, it is a critique of the ways that the people around them set up their societies and their families. And this is, in this section, one of the other very few places where homoerotic relations get mentioned. And they are opposed here because of their association with Canaanites. And with Canaanite religion, it seems. So I'm going to read the other place where we get a comment about homoerotic relations. It's in chapter 18. And it's we're going to read verses 21 through 23. You shall not give any of your offspring to sacrifice them to Molech, and so profane the name of the Lord. I am the Lord. You shall not lie with a male as with a woman. It is an abomination. You shall not have sexual relations with any animal and defile yourself with it, nor shall any woman give herself to an animal to have sexual relations with it. It is perversion. All right. Clearly, the writers of this text are not friendly toward homoerotic relationships. Let's remember first the broad context that we put the last comments about this in, and that is nobody is thinking about homosexuality. They are thinking about married people who, in a heterosexual relationship, who also have sex with people of the same sex. And here, the writers associate that, it seems, with Molech worship. We don't know much about Molech worship, except that Israelites didn't like it. At least, well, the problem is probably lots of them did. And that these writers have to keep saying, don't do that. Or we wouldn't know. And, you know, so it may be the way that these two things are connected here, that homoerotic relations had something to do with Molech worship. It seems there were, in various religions of the ancient Near East, cult prostitutes, both men and women, who engaged in both heterosexual and homoerotic relations. So it might be that it is strictly the association with Molech that gets this sin named. And it may just be that it's what Canaanites do. Now, we should be clear that there are no positive statements about same-sex relations in the biblical text. But we've taken what they do say to mean things they did not intend it to mean. They did not intend to talk about, and what we talk about, as homosexual relationships, as same-sex caring relationships. They didn't intend to talk about people being oriented toward the same-sex people. They see these as examples of the kind of unfaithfulness that you could see in, you know, heterosexual relationships as well. And so it doesn't really get singled out here. We've already had all kinds of instructions about who you cannot have sex with that's of the opposite sex. So here we get a lot less about same-sex relations than we've gotten. Everything previous to this has been about who you can't have a heterosexual relationship with. So we get sort of one sentence about same-sex relations. So it's seen as part of those other cultures. And it gets called an abomination, as lots of things get called abominations. So it's not singling it out. If you read in Leviticus, eating leftovers from a sacrifice on the third day is an abomination. Now, my wife might agree that third day leftovers, they border on abomination, but still, that's the sort of thing. Or you have eating certain kinds of birds is an abomination. Eating unclean food is an abomination. So it's just a really, that's sort of the throwaway term for you'll be in a lot of trouble if you do that, you know, so don't do it. It's a bad thing. Hey, so you get homoerotic relations in the list of things that are like what those around us do. And so things that we're not supposed to do, those things, not participating in those, keeps us from the ways that other people worship, from the gods other people worship, and from the ways that they conduct their lives. So that's the setting in which we should hear those instructions about homoerotic relationships. But these laws are not focused on sexual relationships. Leviticus is interested in all kinds of ways that you construct a society. And it goes beyond saying that you need what we would talk about as justice. That is, that all people get treated fairly. It has instructions about not harvesting the corners of your field. You leave those so that poor people can come by and get food. It has rules about not lying in court, because to do so, you're going to abuse those without power. It says you can't defraud and steal, hold back workers' wages, take advantage of people who can't see or hear. Okay? And all of those commands end with things like, you can't do that because I am the Lord. That doesn't reflect who I am, and so what I expect you to be. And so Leviticus sees the rules, sometimes detailed rules about how to run the temple, about how to set up society, as ways to honor God, as ways to say, we're going to figure out how to reflect who God is in the way that we organize society and in the way that we live our individual and personal lives. Sometimes I've heard people talk about these laws that seem strange to us, like you're not allowed to eat pork, as laws that are designed to keep people healthy. So they made these laws so that, Israelites wouldn't get sick as often as other people or something. Well, they don't work for that. Canaanites figured out how to cook bacon thoroughly a long time before they wrote down these rules. Okay, none of these laws are there for the sake of health or medical matters. They're there to make Israel distinct, to say, don't be like those other people. You have to miss out on bacon because your neighbors eat it. Okay? You don't get to go to brunch at any neighbor's house, because they eat things we don't. And there are all kinds of ways that they try to exemplify this way of staying separate. It's not just whether you can wear a wool and cotton blend. It's you can't plant two different crops in the same field. You got to keep them holy. You got to keep them separate. Okay? You can't breed different animals for the same reason. Hey, you got to keep them separate. And so you sort of live out that distinctiveness in your life in all sorts of ways. They wanted very much to draw a bold line between the lives of Israelites and the lives of the people around them. Not because they were xenophobic, but because they said, there's no other way we will worship only God. If we get the chance, we're going to worship other gods. It's just the way it is. And they were right. And the world was constructed in such a way that worshiping multiple gods was the only thing that made sense. And so they had to incorporate a whole different logic about how you live, including how you dress and what food you eat, just to keep you separate enough to have a chance to be with other people who worship only God. You might just do it too. Okay. So These laws, again, want Israel to stand out and at the same time to be people who reflect God. I mean, a passage in Leviticus 11 that gets quoted in the New Testament is, "For I am the Lord your God. Sanctify yourselves therefore and be holy, for I am holy." That the Petrine epistles say is the basis for Christian ethics, as well as for the ethics for the nation of Israel. And listen, that well-quoted passage comes in the middle of a commandment that tells you not to eat bugs and snakes. So it doesn't have to be a big thing. It just says you need to shape all of your life so that it reflects who God is. We also need to note here, in conjunction with what we said about the giving of the law, that Leviticus and all the other books that talk about temple worship, they do not think that worshiping God correctly in the temple or keeping the law establishes a relationship with God. God has taken the initiative. Sacrifices are the way to maintain the covenant. It's how you say, I'm sorry. I didn't do what I was supposed to. And here's the way I express my sadness. Here's the way I try to make it up to you. You can't make it up to them, of course, but it's a way to say, I'm sorry, I broke our relationship. And you can think about sort of the sacrifices as the stipulations in a contract. You know, if you hire somebody to build a house, you might be able to sneak in there one of those clauses that say, for every day past a certain date, you have to pay me, you know, a certain amount of money if you haven't finished. That's the kind of way sacrifices function. It's like, okay, I failed to live up to my end of the contract. So here's what I do to make up for that. It's kind of built in. So it's not that I do the wrong thing and I'm out of the covenant with God. It's that I'm still in the deal. It's just that now I have to respond properly. Just like when I make Diane mad, I've got to say, I'm sorry, you know, and maybe more than that, you know, depending on what it is. So you've got to find the way that you don't make up for it, but you find a way to express the proper remorse and ask for forgiveness. That's what the sacrifices are about. Saying, I honestly am sorry. Here's the best I can do to show you that I'm sorry. Okay? And you bring those sacrifices. So that's how Leviticus and all the other books of the Old Testament envision sacrifices. It's the means for repairing a relationship that you damaged. All right, let me stop there for a second and see if there are thoughts about this record of the law that we have in Leviticus.
Jerry, I've never understood. Were there really sexual relationships with animals?
I think so, yes. And I don't think it's in the distant past. Oh.
Hey, Jerry, that makes Leviticus seem a lot nicer than what I really thought it was. I've got two questions that are more general in nature, so I can save them till later or ask them now, whatever you want me to do.
Well, go ahead and ask him and then we'll decide.
Okay, you can take a vote. When did the Jewish people finally understand that Moses did not write the first 5 books of the Old Testament?
Well, it might depend on who you ask. There certainly in the first century, folks would have thought so. But by the time you get to certainly the Enlightenment, the same that they're participating in the same kind of study of these texts with the tools of literary criticism and historical criticism that other folks are. So you should think no later than the 18th to 19th century.
But by saying that, there are probably some Jews today who still believe Moses wrote those first 5 books.
Yes,
Okay.
just like there are Christians today who do.
Yeah, okay.
Yep.
That makes sense. I'm good, thank you.
Yeah. All right, we've got a couple more minutes, so let's talk about Deuteronomy for just a minute. Okay. The book of Deuteronomy is a recounting of the law. Some of the same laws are repeated that you find in Exodus and in Numbers. And it's given in the form of a farewell address from Moses. So Moses knows his last days are upon them, so he's going to spend them preaching 4 really long sermons. He's going to tell the people how to live for God, not just one last time, 4 last times. So he gets to telling the stories about Israel in the midst of his farewell addresses. And he tells these stories while he repeats some of the laws, and he uses those narratives, or the writers do, to set the pattern for what happens when the people obey God and what happens when they disobey God. Now, this is, again, not to be taken as sort of literal history. After all, Deuteronomy contains the story of the way that Moses died and was buried. So, Moses would have had a hard time writing that material. So it's written sometime after this, but it wants to have Moses say this because he's the guy. He's the one that they see as the one who sort of met God directly, and so knows what God wants, and so can set out what God wants. And so as Moses sets out again some of the laws, he tells stories about what has happened to Israel in the wilderness, stories of obedience and stories of disobedience, with examples of the consequences of both. And the purpose of that whole book is to set out a pattern for the way that you're supposed to interpret Israel's history. And the books that follow Deuteronomy in the Bible are books that are known as Deuteronomistic history. That is, stories about what happened to Israel that follow the pattern that's set out in Deuteronomy. Now, we're going to talk about those next time. But here, we'll just notice that the expectation that Moses sets out is that if the people are faithful to God, they will be blessed. And if they turn away from God and worship other gods, or sort of organize their societies in ways that do harm to the poor and the vulnerable, then they will suffer. God will take their independence away from them. So if you do one set of things, here's what happens to you. If you do the other set, this is what happens. Now, all of that assumes that in both times, God stays in relationship with the people. God doesn't boot them out of relationship. It's part of the deal. It's written into the contract that this is the way you do it. So I'm going to read tonight from Deuteronomy 11, where this gets set out. So Deuteronomy 11, beginning in verse 26, has Moses say, "See, I'm setting before you today a blessing and a curse. The blessing, if you obey the commandments of the Lord your God that I'm commanding you today, and the curse, if you do not obey the commandments of the Lord your God, but turn from the way I'm commanding you today to follow other gods that you have not known." So that's the deal. How does the covenant work? Just like that. You follow these commands, things go well. You don't follow these commands, things go really bad. Okay? So that's the deal that Israel agreed to when they said, "Yes, we'll be your people." So we'll see how they do with that next week. But we should also note a couple of other things about Deuteronomy before we quit this evening. And one is that one of the most famous and most defining texts for Judaism is in Deuteronomy. In Deuteronomy chapter 6, you have what's known as the Shema, that is to be recited multiple times a day. And it reads like this: "Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God is one, the Lord alone. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your might." Okay? That's what's supposed to be recited multiple times a day. That's what Deuteronomy wants to get people to do. Now, I hope that sounded familiar. So we talk about Jesus giving the two greatest commandments. He didn't come up with them. The first comes from Deuteronomy. Okay? That's the way you love God, and that you have only God as your God. So that's the heart of the faith of Israel. And another thing that we should notice about this giving of the law, again, we have this idea that the law is this terrible burden that they had to keep, that everybody goes around going, "Geez, I guess I won't be able to get that blend jacket after all." Or, if only I could have sausage today, my life would be complete. But that's not the way that it was. As Israel experienced the law, it was a great blessing from God. They were grateful. I mean, sometimes we list off and go, they had over 600 laws. And if you'd ask a good Jew of the first century or the earlier times when these texts are put together, what do you think about those 600? They just said, we wouldn't do without a single one of them. They are great. They make our lives good. And listen to what Deuteronomy says about the law, still in chapter 6, but now in verse 24. "Then the Lord commanded us to observe all these statutes, to fear the Lord our God for our lasting good, so as to keep us alive, as is now the case." Why do you keep the law? For your own good. It's good for you. It makes the best life. I mean, that's why you want to live like God, or you want to reflect God's character. After all, remember, you're created in the image of God. It really is the way you're designed to live. And so the law helps you do that. And so they said, it's not a burden. It's a great blessing to be able to be told, here's the way we know how to serve God. Here's the way we know how to live the way God intended people to live. So it's a good thing. Okay? They didn't feel it as a burden at all. Okay? And I hope we learn to sort of live the way God would call us to live with the same frame of mind, that it actually brings us the best way to live. All right, I've gone over a
Jerry?
little bit. Yes.
Jerry, this is Jill Harris.
Yes.
I wondered, could next time you speak to the difference between ultra-Orthodox and Reformed Jews and how they see the difference between following the laws extremely and not so extremely?
Sure. All right, I will do that.
Thank you.
All right.
Appreciate it.
Yes. Okay. Question is, did Moses really exist as a person? I don't know. I'm certain that the way that Moses is presented is in a way that helps him be seen as sort of the ideal servant of God. And so the questions about Moses are way bigger than just about Moses. There's a school of historians at the moment who don't think there was such a thing as an actual Exodus. And so that it's a story that also draws on various themes. Now, I think there's a good chance that there was some kind of a migration. Those stories are foundational to who Israel understands itself to be. But no single character in all of this has to be exactly the historical person. The earliest person, basically, that we have any sort of record outside of Scripture for existing is King David. And the evidence for that is, there's an inscription about the house of David. And so there seems to actually have been a guy named David, who was certainly of the nobility. So it seems likely real King David. And for by the time we get there, most of the people who are named as kings are certainly real people. But that doesn't mean that the stories that get told about them are historical in the way that we expect history to be written. Remember, our text keeps saying, if you want to hear that kind of history, go read something else. Okay, go read it in that other book. This is a story about how God has been active in the life of Israel. So it's always hard to say as you keep going back farther what they hang these historical portraits on.
Jerry, question. So it sounds like the law was defining the relationship between God and a Jew. But what about, was it kind of self-centered laws? Did it have some outreach to it? And the second great commandment, do unto others as you would have them do unto you. Did Jesus invent that?
Well, he may be the first one to phrase it exactly like that, but he's not the first one to express that sentiment. So rabbis had said it. I mean, we have records of earlier rabbis saying it backwards, like, don't do to anybody what you would find to be hateful. So same basic principle, just said a little bit differently. Let's see. I was trying to think. What was the other part of your question? Outreach.
600 laws. Any outreach? Yeah.
Yes. There are lots of laws about how to treat one another equitably and justly and mercifully as a society. So as they set up the legal system, having the same treatment for everybody was not permissible. You had to treat people better if they were vulnerable. So For example, you might be able to charge some people interest, but not people who are poor. You might be able to keep some collateral for some debts, but not if it's a poor person. There are plenty of laws about how you should treat strangers and foreigners. So there are lots of laws about how to organize a society that is a merciful society and a just society. They don't talk about, sort of, trying to recruit members or anything. That's not that kind of outreach, but they are expected to treat those without sort of the connections that we talked about in the story with Sodom. In Israel, you don't get to treat people that way. There are laws about how you treat folks who don't have those legal protections. So yes, they even had restrictive laws about slavery. So slavery was still horrible, but in Israel, there were laws that limited the use of slaves in ways that others of their neighbors did not have. So I'm not sure if that gets to all the outreach you have in mind or not.
Good examples, good examples. Yeah, thank you.
Okay. All right.